On behalf of my colleagues at the International Center for Law and Religion Studies, welcome to the 2021 Religious Freedom Annual Review. My name is Brett Scharfs, Director of the Center. Once again, and hopefully for the last time, we gather entirely online rather than in person. But we hope this format, once again, makes it easier for a much larger audience than usual to be with us, stretching across the globe. We believe we have something truly special in store for you this year, beginning with keynote addresses by Peter Wehner, one of our nation's leading public intellectuals, on issues of religious freedom and the role of religion in the public square, followed by Elder Dale G. Renlund and our own senior fellow, Sister Ruth Renlund. We will then have a series of presentations on religious identity and dignity, featuring Asma Uddin, a leading Muslim voice for religious freedom and understanding, and Elder L. Whitney Clayton, an Emeritus General Authority and former president of the Quorums of the 70. I will also provide an update on our center's work on human dignity and religious identity. Tomorrow, we'll feature a panel on civil religion, nationalism, and patriotism with experts from a wide variety of backgrounds, as well as a discussion about President Dallin H. Oakes's recent magnificent General Conference address on defending our divinely inspired Constitution. We will finish with a Supreme Court roundup on Supreme Court cases, many of which were decided in the last year, focusing on cases that balance religious freedom and the right to gather against public health, as well as what many observers believe is the most significant religious freedom case of the past 10 years, Fulton versus Philadelphia, about whether a Catholic adoption agency can operate in a way that is consistent with Catholic faith. A few weeks ago, I was having a discussion with our 15 summer fellows, law students who have just finished their first year, about what they are feeling as we emerge from more than a year of the coronavirus epidemic. As you can imagine, there were a variety of responses, including apprehensive, cautious, fragile, and uneasy. Others described feelings of being confused, concerned, tired, or exhausted. Others described feeling optimistic and ready to party. One word that comes to my mind is amplification. Many of the things that bedeviled us as a society before the pandemic seem to have been amplified, including the extent to which we are politically divided, our levels of distrust of important institutions, including government and the media, and an increase in economic and social inequalities. On the other hand, we have seen also amplification of positive characteristics of our society, including our willingness to sacrifice for the common good, countless acts of quiet service, and even heroism by our frontline health workers and so many others, and an increase in focusing on things that matter most, such as family and faith. Perhaps the thing that has worried me the most is an acceleration in the rise of identity politics, which urges us to see each other and judge each other primarily based upon our differences, such as the color of our skin, our gender, our religion. If we see each other primarily on the basis of race, the inevitable consequence will be racism. If we see each other primarily on the basis of sex, the inevitable consequence will be sexism. If we see each other primarily on the basis of our religion, the inevitable consequence will be religious discrimination. The challenge of seeing each other deeply in our complexity and with an awareness of our differences, while holding to values such as equality, non-discrimination, and due process, has become quite difficult. As I will discuss a little later, the concept of human dignity for everyone, everywhere, encourages us to see each other in our many identities while offering a roadmap out of the quagmire of identity politics. I am confident that the speakers we will learn from over the next 2 days will provide a number of valuable strategies for helping us navigate the challenging times in which we live. Once again, welcome to the Religious Freedom Annual Review. With so much that divides us, we believe religious freedom for all is something that can and should unite us. We are so happy to be with you. Our Associate Director, Elizabeth Clark, will introduce today's keynote speakers.
I'm so delighted to welcome you to the Religious Freedom Annual Review and to introduce our keynote speakers. My name is Elizabeth Clark. I'm Associate Director at the Center for Law and Religion Studies. We're tremendously blessed to have 3 thoughtful, gracious, and humble individuals with a wealth of experience joining us today: Peter Wehner, Elder Dale G. Renlund, and Sister Ruth L. Renlund. First, we'll hear from Peter Wehner, who's a Senior Fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. Mr. Wehner is an editor of The Atlantic magazine and an active contributor to numerous national newspapers and magazines, such as the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post. He recently served as a visiting professor at Duke University and previously worked in both the Reagan and George H.W. Bush administrations before becoming Deputy Director of Speechwriting for President George W. Bush. He also headed the Office of Strategic Initiatives in 2002, where he advised on a range of domestic and international policy issues. Mr. Wehner has authored several books, including, most recently, The Death of Politics: How to Heal Our Frayed Republic After Trump, published in 2019. We'll hear from Elder and Sister Renlund. Elder Dale G. Renlund has served as a member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints since October 2015. Elder Renlund has previously served in numerous church callings in areas such as Sweden, Southeast Africa, and others. Prior to his call to full-time church service, Elder Renlund was a professor of medicine at the University of Utah and the medical director of the Utah Transplantation-Affiliated Hospital's Cardiac Transplant Program. He received a BA and MD degrees from the University of Utah and additional medical training from Johns Hopkins University. Sister Ruth L. Renlund received her bachelor's degree in history from the University of Utah and a Juris Doctorate from the University of Maryland School of Law. Her legal expertise includes practicing plaintiff civil litigation, working in the Utah Attorney General's office, and serving as the first female president of the Utah Trial Lawyers Association, among other distinctions. Sister Renlund has also served in many church callings, and we're grateful that she continues to apply her legal experience as a Senior Fellow of the International Center for Law and Religion Studies. First, we'll hear from Pete Wehner. Thank you, Pete.
It's a pleasure to be with you. I want to begin by expressing my gratitude to the BYU International Center for Law and Religious Studies, along with the BYU's Wheatley Institution, for organizing this event on the importance of religious liberty. And I want to especially acknowledge the superb work of Professor Elizabeth Clark, the Associate Director of International Center for Law and Religious Studies, and to Sherry Rogdi, whose efforts in organizing the conference have been indispensable. The theme of this year's conference, Religion's Role in Overcoming Divides and Strengthening American Democracy, is so timely because our divisions are so deep and so daunting. To answer the urgent question of what role religion can play in being an agent of repair and reconciliation, it's helpful to briefly assess the polarized state of the nation. As everyone knows, we've just experienced one of the most difficult and divisive years in our history. In 2020, we faced a once-in-a-century pandemic, racial unrest, protests in the streets, a deeply contentious election, and an unprecedented act of political violence in which the citadel of democracy, the U.S. Capitol, was attacked by people seeking to overturn the results of a free and fair election. Even common sense public health measures to take in the midst of a pandemic, measures like wearing masks and social distancing, were politicized to the point where they became symbols of America's culture war. Survey data confirms that we're seeing intense partisan divisions and animosity. Partisans' views of the opposing party are now more negative than at any point in memory. Knowledgeable observers are saying that the nation is confronting the greatest strain to its fundamental cohesion since the Civil War. Majorities in both parties expressed not just unfavorable, but very unfavorable views of the other party. Sizable shares of both Democrats and Republicans say the other party stirs feelings not just of frustration, but fear and anger. Studies tell us that Democrats and Republicans both say that the other party's members are hypocritical, selfish, and closed-minded, and that they are unwilling to socialize across party lines. These trends were happening even before the nation was waylaid by COVID-19, when the objective conditions of the country were reasonably good. So there's something deeper going on, issues having to do with our soul and spirit, confusion of purpose, a breakdown in human relationships and intimacy. As a friend of mine put it, there's the feeling that we're at each other's throat. There's no sense of pride in being part of anything, and no sense of belonging. Social scientists now speak about America coming apart, by which they mean a new upper class and a new lower class have dramatically diverged in core behaviors and values. The top and bottom of white America increasingly live in different cultures, with the powerful upper class living in enclaves surrounded by their own kind, ignorant of life in mainstream America, and the lower class suffering from erosions of family and community life that strike at the heart of the pursuit of happiness. That divergence puts the success of the American project at risk. For the purposes of this event, I'll focus on the Christian church in general and American evangelicalism in particular. That's the world I know best. It's the faith community I've spent much of my life in, and evangelicals make up fully 1/4 of the US population. So what happens in that particular subculture matters to the rest of the nation. It's important to point out that there are millions and millions of individual Christians doing remarkable work to care for those living in the shadows of society and healing our nation's wounds. Most people of the Christian faith I know are decent and honorable people, good citizens, and I'm indebted to people of the Christian faith who have helped shape me and who have come alongside me in times of hardship and grief. But in terms of our common life, our civic society, our political life, there's been a breakdown. And let me go a step further. Much of what is being done by evangelical Christians is damaging our civic fabric and undermining the public witness of Christianity. The way many Christians are engaging in politics is troubling. And if I had to boil down my concerns to a single sentence, it would be this. In too many cases, evangelicals are subordinating Christian faith to political tribalism, partisan loyalties, and political power. And in doing so, they're using methods and means that are fundamentally at odds with what the American theologian Eugene Peterson called the Jesus way. Peterson argued that the American church is enamored with the truth of Jesus, but ignores the method by which Jesus embodied that truth. Christianity is obviously not just about affirming a particular creed or set of dogmas, but following the way of Jesus, modeling one's ways and means after him. That goes for every area of our lives, including political and cultural engagement. According to Peterson, we can't suppress the Jesus way in order to sell the Jesus truth. The Jesus way and the Jesus truth must be congruent. A non-Christian I know told me that what is unfolding is consistent with what sociobiology theorizes about religion. Its evolutionary purpose is to foster in-group solidarity. Principles serve rather than rule that mission. Now, this isn't my view of faith, but in the current circumstances, given what's played out in public over the last few decades, and especially over the last half decade, this is not an unreasonable conclusion for him to draw, and he's not alone. That kind of perception is multiplying. A reporter I know visited a leading evangelical college prior to the pandemic. He spent time with 14 political science students and wrote me saying that most of them said that they were much less willing to be identified as evangelicals, not because they had a crisis of faith exactly, he told me, but because they were so sickened by the way evangelicals had squandered their moral authority and acted with such transparent hypocrisy during recent years. I've heard from pastors in different parts of America who describe what's happening as a generational catastrophe, in large part because young people in particular see faith as an instrument of division in our democracy instead of an instrument of healing. My concern then is that many Christians are not offering an alternative to the worst tendencies in our society, but rather accelerating them. We need to turn that around. Followers of Jesus need to light candles instead of simply curse the darkness. And there are things that can be done writ small and writ large. Some of them are connected to politics, many are not, but together they can influence our culture and our wider society for the better. With that in mind, here's some suggestions for how faith, and specifically the Christian faith, can be a healing force in American society and strengthen American democracy. First, we need to articulate and show we take seriously Christian anthropology. What I mean by that is that we need to demonstrate to a watching world in a compelling and persuasive way that we're made in the image of God, and that others, including those with whom we have deep disagreements, are also made in the image of God. The Latin term imago Dei has its roots in Genesis, where we're told God created man and woman in his own image. This scriptural passage implies that we humans are in the image of God in their moral, spiritual, and intellectual nature, that each of us has inestimable worth and inherent dignity. There are special qualities of human nature which allow God to be manifest in each of us. The great distinctiveness of Christian involvement in public life should be to care for all, for those within our political and religious tribes and those without. There should be no one on the outside treated as an alien or subhuman, including and even especially the poor and the weak, the dispossessed and the abused, the wounded traveler on the road to Jericho. Think about how profoundly better things would be if we showed the world that we won't pass on the other side. Second, Christians need to model listening well. We need to listen in order to learn, not just to listen in order to respond. We know that to successfully communicate with people who hold views that are different than we do, they need to feel heard, to feel others are showing a genuine interest in them. It isn't effective to lecture people or to marshal facts in an effort to overwhelm them, and it certainly doesn't work to make others feel insulted or dishonored or under attack. We need to show a real interest in others, which builds trust, which in turn builds bridges. But it goes deeper than that. There is such a thing as collective wisdom, and that we're better off if we have within our orbit people who see the world somewhat differently than we do. As iron sharpens iron, the book of Proverbs says, so one person sharpens another. This requires us to actually engage with and carefully listen to people who understand things in ways dissimilar to how we do. It means that we have to venture out of our philosophical and theological cul-de-sacs, our bubbles from time to time, but it's worth the effort. We also need to see those with whom we disagree in mid-story and see ourselves in mid-story as well. None of us are completed works. We need to keep in mind, too, what has been said of Pope Francis. He is an evangelist, not an activist. He believes in encounter rather than confrontation. Third, people of the Christian faith should model what it means to debate and to disagree well. All of us can do better at viewing debate, less as an arena for conquest and more as an arena for learning. Let me explain what I mean. C.S. Lewis referred to his childhood friend Arthur Greeves as his first friend, and the philosopher and poet Owen Barfield as his second friend. A first friend, according to Lewis, is one's alter ego, the person who first reveals to you that you are not alone in the world by turning out to share all of your most secret delights. There is nothing to be overcome in making him your friend. He and you join like raindrops on a window. A second friend is the person who, in the words of Lewis, disagrees with you about everything. He's not so much the alter ego as the anti-self. Of course he shares your interests, otherwise he wouldn't be your friend at all. But he has approached them at a different angle. He's read all the right books, but he's gotten wrong things out of every one. It is as if he spoke your language but mispronounced it. How can he be so nearly right and yet invariably just not right? Lewis went on to say, when you set out to correct his heresies, you find that he forsooth to correct yours, and then you go at it, hammer and tong, far into the night, night after night, each learning the weight of the other's punches and often more like mutually respectful enemies than friends. Actually, though it never seemed so at the time, you modify one another's thoughts. Out of this perpetual dogfight of community of mind and a deep affection emerge. What's striking is that both Lewis and Barfield treasured their relationship precisely because they helped each other see things that they would otherwise have been blind to. They felt like they helped each other widen the aperture of understanding when it came to seeing truth. In argument, Barfield said, we always, both of us, were arguing for the truth, not for victory. If we could move closer to the Lewis Barfield model of dialogue and debate, we'd all be far better off, and it would certainly help us think of our national politics as something other than a fight to the death. Fourth, Christians should model humility and epistemic modesty. Over breakfast a few years ago with a friend of mine, the social psychologist Jonathan Haidt, I asked him what constructive contribution Christians could make to public life. An atheist who finds much to admire in religion, John answered simply, humility. That is a perfectly reasonable hope. Yet humility is hardly a hallmark of American Christianity, especially, but by no means exclusively, among those Christians prominently involved in politics. There we often see arrogance, haughtiness, and pride, which is not only the original sin, but also arguably the one most antithetical to a godly cast of mind. My own understanding of humility is inextricably tied to a decades-long journey of faith. From it, I have become convinced that Christians should be characterized by humility. This doesn't mean followers of Jesus should be indifferent to a moral order, grounded in eternal truths, or unable to judge some things right and others wrong. They ought to be alert first and foremost to their own shortcomings, to the awareness of how wayward our own hearts are, how even good acts are often tainted by selfish motives, how we all struggle with brokenness in our lives. This is not an argument for self-loathing, it's an argument for self-awareness. The core of Christian doctrine is the belief that we've all fallen short, that our loves are disordered and our lives sometimes a mess, and therefore we are in need of grace. As a result, one of the defining qualities of a Christian's witness to the world should be gentleness, an ironic spirit, and empathy. The mark of genuine humility is not self-abasement as much as self-forgetting, which in turn allow us to take an intense interest in the lives of others. In my last conversation with him before he died in 2015, Steve Wehner, who was president of Columbia Theological Seminary and an enormously influential figure in my life, put it well. I believe in objective truth, he told me, but I hold lightly to our ability to perceive truth. What Steve meant by this, I think, is the world is unfathomably complex. To believe we have mastered it in all respects, that our angle of vision on matters like politics, philosophy, and theology is just right all the time, is ridiculous. It doesn't mean one ought to live in a state of perpetual doubt and uncertainty. If we did, we could never speak up for justice and moral truth. It does mean, however, that we're aware that what we know is at best incomplete. You see through a glass darkly is how St. Paul put it in one of his letters to the Corinthians. We know only in part. And my point is not that humility is uniquely available to Christians. It is simply that Christian teaching and tradition, from its importance, none of us see the truth in its totality, and all of us need to have the eyes and the ears of others, friends, family members, writers, those from earlier ages to help us in the journey. Fifth, we should model grace. Here we can learn from the author Philip Yancey, who in his marvelous book, What's So Amazing About Grace, wrote this: grace comes free of charge to people who do not deserve it, and I'm one of those people. I think back to who I was, resentful, wound tight with anger, a single hardened link in a long chain of ungrace learned from family and church. Now I'm trying in my own small way to pipe the tune of grace. I do so because I know, more surely than I know anything, that any pang of healing or forgiveness of goodness I have ever felt comes solely from the grace of God. I yearn for the church to become a nourishing culture of that grace. In his marvelous biography on Abraham Lincoln, originally published in 1917, Lord Charnwood said of him, this most unrelenting enemy to the project of the Confederacy was the one man who had quite purged his heart and mind from hatred or even anger toward his fellow countrymen of the South. Here's a more contemporary example. 6 summers ago, 9 African Americans were gunned down during a Bible study at Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. The gunman, Dylan Roof, was motivated by racism. Less than 48 hours after the killing, the victims' families were allowed to speak directly to Roof at his first court appearance. The family members spoke in honest, unaffected ways about their grief and heartache. Yet they bestowed forgiveness upon the man who had killed their loved one. It was an extraordinary moment. These Christians vividly demonstrated how forgiveness can result in not just healing, but also political change. Within days of their courtroom appearance, South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley endorsed removing the Confederate flag from state grounds. Within weeks, the state legislature voted to take it down. People who would not have reversed course under the threat of boycotts and political attacks changed their minds after amazing acts of grace. Division gave way to unity because a group of wounded Christians elevated the sights and spirit of everyone around them. The greatest and most powerful Christian distinctive is not the exercise of power. It is the offer of grace. In saying this, I want to emphasize again that in offering grace and listening well to others and in showing proper humility, we should not be indifferent to telling the truth or calling out lies and liars, or fail to criticize what deserves criticism, or stay silent in the face of wrongdoing. Christians are not called to be passive in the face of maliciousness. A few years ago, Mark Labberton, president of Fuller Theological Seminary, delivered a lecture, Creating Beauty in Exile, that helped me to see things in a different way than I have in the past. In the lecture, he offers a distinct way for Christians to conceive of their calling, for people who see themselves as living in a promised land and demanding it back, to living a faithful, exilic life. It's a very different approach, creating different expectations and understanding of our situation, our place, our posture, and our purpose. President Labberton speaks about what it means to live as people in exile, trying to find the capacity to love in unexpected ways, to see the enemy, the foreigner, the stranger, and the alien, and to go toward them rather than away from them. He asks what a life of faithfulness looks like while living in a world of fear. In the lecture, Labberton recounts remarkable stories of people creatively, courageously, and faithfully engaging with the world. The woman who lost 41 relatives in the Rwandan Civil War and yet finds a way to extend grace amidst the toxicity of bitterness, resentment, and hatred. The woman and her guild who made beautiful quilts for those traumatized and suffering in hospitals in Eastern Congo, showing there was a place for beauty even in the context of utter dislocation and violence. The church that held traditional beliefs on human sexuality, tending to the AIDS garden in the Golden Gate Park with humility, love, kindness, and compassion, and in the process, developing understanding, trust, and meaningful relationships. An African-American student bearing witness to a racial reality he faces that would otherwise go unseen by others. Egyptians on the Fuller campus who, in the aftermath of ISIS killings of Christians in Egypt, turned a memorial service into a celebration of those who were martyred. Mark Labberton concludes his lecture this way, quote, "The reason this enterprise of culture care is so critical is because it awakens to us, as the artist Maki Fujimura often says, no longer talking in terms of culture war, but culture care. Culture care is an expression of faithful, exilic life. How do we actually show up building houses, planting gardens, loving and seeking justice, bringing people who seek the shalom of our enemy fortress, for it's in that shalom that we find our shalom? These are calls to a different set of instincts, and I hope that we acknowledge we are in a period where the tectonic plates are shifting, where the church is in one of the deepest moments of crisis, not because of some election result or not, but because of what has been exposed to be the poverty of the American church and its capacity to be able to see and love and serve and engage in ways in which we simply fail to do. And that vocation is the vocation that must be recovered and must be made real in tangible action." Unquote. I'll close with a final thought. I've spent my entire life in politics, and I don't regret having done so for a moment. I understand politics as downsides and dark sides, which is simply to say it is a human enterprise like every other on earth. But it does matter, and it should matter to people of faith. The reason is that politics is, at the end of the day, when all is said and done, about pursuing justice, even if imperfectly, and justice always matters. So my encouragement to others, and especially to the younger generation, is don't withdraw from politics, but do find a better way to engage with it. The political cultural movement I have in mind will require Christians to make a compelling case for social order and moral excellence, but done with generosity of spirit, all the while offering a healing touch. It will require Christians to be less fearful and more hopeful, less anxious and more confident that God is sovereign and his purposes don't ultimately rest on ours. Christians engaged in public life should model calm trust rather than panic and vitriol born of anxiety. We are called to be faithful, not successful. So keep a critical distance, be willing to speak the truth to power, hold on to timeless principles, seek the welfare of the city to which you've been called. Don't compromise your integrity in exchange for access to power, and use the same ethical standards of people in your own party as you do for people in the other party. The words of Martin Luther King Jr. are instructive. The church must be reminded that it is not the master or the servant of the state, but rather the conscience of the state, he said. It must be a guide and the critic of the state, and never its tool. I'm grateful to those of you who, because of your faithfulness and your love of country, have acted as the conscience of the state. Thank you very much.
We're delighted to participate in this annual review. We're grateful for the excellent work of all those associated with the Center. Both the quality and the quantity of work the Center does are impressive.
This year's annual review considers religion's contribution to strengthening American democracy. Our remarks today are more narrowly centered, however, on Joseph Smith and how he, as a religious leader, contributed to strengthening American democracy.
We've relied heavily on the Joseph Smith papers, including Volume 14, which is being prepared for publication, and the excellent historical context provided by church historians. We also thank Brandon Metcalf, an archivist and historian and manager of executive services in the Church History Department, for his editorial assistance and for providing the images we will use.
The history surrounding the founding of the United States is simultaneously inspiring and infuriating. From our present perspective, we can see both the promise of the lofty goals and the results of the omissions and compromises that were made in drafting the U.S. Constitution. The freedoms promised to all were not available to all. The liberties claimed for all were not enforced for all. And the security promised to all was not protected for all.
Many have experienced these contradictions. Among them are Joseph Smith, the prophet of the restoration of the Church of Jesus Christ in these latter days, and early church members.
Despite the guarantees in the U.S. Constitution of the free exercise of religion, the right to peaceably assemble, and the right to petition the government for a redress of grievances, the early saints struggled to practice their religious beliefs without interference. The enumerated rights did not extend to their brand of religion.
Time after time, when Joseph Smith called on government officials to enforce enumerated constitutional rights for him and his fellow saints, he was turned away. His interest in religious freedom was not theoretical. It was a repeatedly lived experience. He had been directed by heaven to restore the Church of Christ. Without the rights to freely exercise their religion, to peaceably assemble, and to petition the government for redress, church members were prevented from physically gathering and establishing roots in a geographical location of their choosing due to repeated forced evacuations. Despite these challenges, the membership in the church continued to increase. From New York to Ohio and from Missouri to Illinois, persecution and unlawful arrests followed Joseph Smith and other church leaders. In Missouri, Latter-day Saint adult men met the criteria to participate in the democratic process by voting. But several factors caused contention related to the saints voting in Missouri. Missourians felt threatened by the sheer number of saints and their ability to control local elections. Another point of conflict was the opposing view on slavery. Anticipating that Latter-day Saint votes would skew toward anti-slavery, their votes were suppressed by pro-slavery Missouri citizens. Their eventual expulsion from that state under the threat of several thousand members of the state militia left them homeless and friendless. When Joseph petitioned President Martin Van Buren for redress, the president infamously said, "Your cause is just, but I can do nothing for you."
Once settled in Illinois, the saints' numbers grew to 25,000, and their votes were eagerly sought. Regional and national politics played a significant role in Joseph Smith's life during the August 1843 election cycle. In preparation for the congressional election, the Whig candidate, Cyrus Walker, and the Democratic candidate, Joseph P. Hogue, spent considerable time electioneering in Nauvoo, hoping to secure the Latter-day Saint vote. Because Joseph Smith previously pledged to vote for Walker, one of Joseph's personal attorneys, most observers believed that Walker would easily win the election. However, at a public meeting held 2 days before the election, Hyrum Smith announced that he had received a revelation indicating that the Saints should support Hogue, the Democratic candidate. At a public Sunday worship service held the next day, Joseph delivered a discourse in which he affirmed his personal pledge to vote for Walker, but did not raise objections to Hyrum Smith's revelation for the Saints. Joseph stated that he'd never known Hyrum to lie. Nauvoo residents overwhelmingly voted for Hogue, who carried the election in Illinois' 6th congressional district. The Whigs blamed the church for the loss, and the Democrats did not appreciate Joseph's support of the Whig candidate. Joseph and the church were bereft of political friends, and opponents took advantage of this situation. A few months later, Joseph wrote to the 5 candidates for President of the United States, asking what they would do to help the Saints redress the legal wrongs they had suffered. 2 did not respond. The other 3 said they would do nothing. With frustration mounting, leaders of the church met and encouraged Joseph to run for the United States presidency. On the 29th of January, 1844, Joseph announced his candidacy for that year's presidential election. His campaign was part of a larger effort to pursue legal avenues that might result in the protection of the church and its members.
That being said, Joseph was not anxious to enter the political arena, declaring in a letter to the editor of the Wasp, a weekly Nauvoo newspaper, after his announcement, that his feelings revolt at the idea of having anything to do with politics. He stated that he wished to be let alone, that he may attend strictly to the spiritual welfare of the church. Nonetheless, with the help of W. Phelps, Joseph Smith composed a 12-page pamphlet entitled General Smith's Views of the Power and Policy of the Government of the United States. As was the custom of the day, the pamphlet began with a brief history of the United States that focused on the administrations of the country's first 10 presidents. It included excerpts from the inaugural, annual, and farewell addresses of most of the presidents. The statements selected were, of course, those that Joseph agreed with. We get a sense of his political philosophy by the portions of prior presidents' addresses included in his own address to the people. For example, the pamphlet contains this statement regarding George Washington. And one of the noble fathers of our freedom and country's glory, great in war, great in peace, great in the estimation of the world, and great in the hearts of his countrymen, the illustrious Washington said in his first inaugural address to Congress, "The foundations of our national policy will be laid in the pure and immutable principles of private morality, and the preeminence of free government be exemplified by all the attributes which can win the affections of its citizens and command the respect of the world."
In equally laudable language, the pamphlet celebrated the terms of the first 7 presidents up through Andrew Jackson. But Joseph Smith had scathing things to say when it came to Martin Van Buren. Joseph claimed that the election of Van Buren was the precise moment when the nation began to decline. Joseph had been a vocal critic of Van Buren since meeting with him in Washington, D.C. in 1839. During their meeting, Van Buren refused to assist the Latter-day Saints in their efforts to obtain redress and reparations from the federal government for their expulsion from Missouri. Not surprisingly, then, the pamphlet depicted Van Buren as unconcerned with maintaining the constitutional rights of the American people. A sample from that section of the pamphlet illustrates how Joseph really felt about President Van Buren. At the age then of 60 years, our blooming republic began to decline under the withering touch of Martin Van Buren. Disappointed ambition, thirst for power, pride, corruption, party spirit, faction, patronage, perquisites, fame, tangled alliances, priestcraft, and spiritual wickedness in high places struck hands and reveled in midnight splendor. That says it all. The remainder of the pamphlet consists of Joseph's political platform, framed as a plan to improve the government of the United States and the lives of its citizens. It included several proposals for reform, including constitutional, economic, and social measures. Specifically mentioned are minority rights, a national bank, the criminal justice system, the abolition of slavery, and territorial expansion.
Joseph believed that the Constitution was flawed because it did not compel the executive or legislative branches to use federal power to defend minority rights. He proposed that the President of the United States be constitutionally allowed to dispatch the Army to suppress mobs in individual states or without first receiving a request from a state's governor to do so. A sample from the section of the pamphlet on constitutional reform reads, "Give every man his constitutional freedom, and the President full power to send an army to suppress mobs, and the state's authority to repeal and impugn that relic of folly which makes it necessary for the governor of a state to make the demand of the President for troops. In case of invasion or rebellion, the governor himself may be the mobber, and instead of being punished, as he should for murder and treason, he may destroy the very lives, rights, and property he should protect." Now, why do you think this was Joseph's proposal for constitutional reform?
Well, surely one of the reasons is that this proposal would remove any real or perceived barriers to enforcing minority rights that were threatened by mobs, state militia, or government officials. The lack of such a provision in the Constitution is the reason that Van Buren gave for being unable to help the saints.
Joseph's proposals for economic reform centered on banking. He called for the establishment of a national bank with branches in every state and territory, and officers who would be elected by the American people and paid a modest per diem for their service. He stated that such a network of banks would ensure a dependable national currency and would ease financial difficulties caused by irregularities and frequent shortages of currency throughout the country. A sample from that section of the pamphlet reads, "For the accommodation of the people in every state and territory, let Congress show their wisdom by granting a national bank with branches in every state and territory where the capital stock shall be held by the nation for the mother bank, and the bill shall be par throughout the nation, which will mercifully cure that fatal disorder known in cities as brokerage, and leave the people's money in their own pockets." Now, why do you think Joseph proposed banking changes as economic reform?
Well, the saints suffered terrible losses in the banking collapse in the 1830s. The Kirtland Safety Society Bank was caught up in the collapse when hundreds of banks failed. Allegations of corruption in the banks that served only the interests of wealthy speculators added to the urgency for reform. The third plank of Joseph's platform called for social reform and an overhaul of the criminal justice system in the United States. He called for a drastic decrease in the number of men and women incarcerated in prisons and penitentiaries. This suggests that Joseph viewed the system that sentenced men and women to prison as flawed and as administering justice unevenly based on the economic status of the accused. A sample from that section of the pamphlet reads, "Petition your state legislatures to pardon every convict in their several penitentiaries, blessing them as they go and saying to them in the name of the Lord, 'Go thy way and sin no more.' Advise your legislators when they make laws for larceny, burglary, or any felony, to make the penalty applicable to work upon roads, public works, or any place where the culprit can be taught more wisdom and virtue and become more enlightened. Rigor and seclusion will never do as much to reform the propensities of man as reason and friendship. Murder only can claim confinement or death. Let the penitentiaries be turned into seminaries of learning, where intelligence like the angels of heaven would banish such fragments of barbarism. Imprisonment for debt is a meaner practice than the savage tolerates with all his ferocity. Why do you think prison reform was on Joseph's political agenda?
I think his own experience of being arrested and jailed on various occasions must have given him a clear view of the unfairness inherent in the prison system. Joseph advocated for treating people with dignity and sincerely believed people were capable of learning and changing. He had little economic status in life, and his imprisonments deepened his compassion for others in his situation. He had sympathy, too, for those arrested according to the debtor laws of the day. His father was once arrested for a $14 debt, which today is about $400. His writing suggests that he believed that the United States could and should be better. The last major piece of Joseph's platform called for the end of slavery. The issue of slavery created a sharp divide in the United States both politically and economically. This issue permeated the discussion around the admission of additional states into the Union and territorial expansion. Joseph was clear where he stood on the issue. Break off the shackles from the poor black man and hire him to labor like other human beings, for an hour of virtuous liberty on earth is worth an eternity of bondage. Restore freedom. Break down slavery. Joseph's call for the emancipation of all American slaves would be paid for from the sale of public lands by the federal government and by cutting the salaries of Congress. Now, why would Joseph address the contentious issue of slavery as a presidential candidate?
Well, in many ways, slavery was the issue of the day. But for Joseph, it was also a matter of right versus wrong. He understood from restored doctrine that all the human family are God's spirit children. He believed in the dignity and equal rights of all humankind, and he was in sympathy with them, for their rights were trampled upon, just as his had been. The pamphlet concludes with Joseph's philosophy of good government and promises he makes as a potential precedent. The following is an excerpt from Joseph Smith's closing argument to the people. In the United States, the people are the government, and their united voice is the only sovereign that should rule, the only power that should be obeyed. Wherefore, were I the President of the United States by the voice of a virtuous people, I would honor the old paths of the venerated fathers of freedom. I would walk in the tracks of the illustrious patriots. And when the people petitioned to abolish slavery in the slave states, I would use all honorable means to have their prayers granted and give liberty to the captive. Let us be one great family, and let there be universal peace. The pamphlet is signed, with the highest esteem, I am a friend of virtue and of all the people, Joseph Smith.
After the pamphlet was approved, Joseph arranged for Apostle John Taylor to print 1,500 copies in the church's print shop in Nauvoo. Joseph Smith mailed copies of the pamphlet to President John Tyler and members of his cabinet, the 9 justices of the Supreme Court, several senators and representatives in the United States Congress, the governor of each state, the editors of prominent newspapers throughout the country, and others. In total, he mailed approximately 200 copies of the pamphlet. The remaining copies sold out a few months later, and a new edition was printed. The church sent out hundreds of electioneering missionaries who carried the pamphlets with them throughout the country. General Smith's views was well received in Nauvoo and by church members throughout the country. The Prophet, a Latter-day Saint newspaper published in New York City, not surprisingly endorsed General Joseph Smith for president and Sidney Rigdon, his running mate, for vice president. Responses from outside the church were often negative. Hounded by mobs throughout the campaign, Joseph was ultimately killed by one, while under state government protection, the first presidential candidate to be assassinated. John Tyler was re-elected president in late 1844. Joseph's campaign was cut short due to his death. His campaign was intended to muster sympathy for the church's cause and give the saints an agreeable candidate in the election. Despite the abbreviated campaign, what contribution did Joseph make to strengthening American democracy?
Joseph's assassination demonstrated the point of his campaign, that democratic rights for people to practice their religion had been completely ignored, and it cost him his life. Underlying Joseph's thinking on democracy in the United States was his firmly held belief that constitutional rights, freedom of religion, and universal freedom should be available to all, including those in minority groups. His very approach to democracy is one that is still being debated and examined today. Joseph viewed democratic rights through the lens of religious freedom. It was not that democratic rights emanated from religious freedom, rather that the abrogation of religious freedom was a marker for undemocratic government. He spoke and wrote on the subject repeatedly.
While a candidate for the U.S. presidency, Joseph addressed the Council of 50, a group of church and community leaders in a meeting on April 11, 1844. Arguing that the agency God gave his children requires mortals also to grant and safeguard the freedom of religion, Joseph Smith declared, "Nothing can reclaim the human mind from its ignorance, bigotry, superstition, and so forth, but those grand and sublime principles of equal rights and universal freedom to all men. Hence, in all governments or political transactions, a man's religious opinions should never be called in question. A man should be judged by the law, independent of religious prejudice."
Joseph was unique in his day for his insistence that not only should the Latter-day Saints' religious rights be protected, but that this protection should be extended to all. His position was not manufactured for his presidential run, but a long-held belief. In 1841, well before his candidacy for president, Joseph wrote, "Now, if they had been pagans, or in fine, sir, if their religion was as false as hell, what right should men have to drive them from their homes and their country, or to exterminate them, so long as their religion did not interfere with the civil rights of men, according to the laws of our country? None at all."
The city of Nauvoo was founded on the principle of religious tolerance and freedom. The Nauvoo Charter provided, "Be it ordained by the City Council of the City of Nauvoo that the Catholics, Presbyterians, Methodists, Baptists, Latter-day Saints, Quakers, Episcopalians, Universalists, Unitarians, Muslims, and all other religious sects and denominations whatever, shall have free toleration and equal privileges in this city, and should any person be guilty of ridiculing, abusing, or otherwise depreciating another in consequence of his religion, or of disturbing or interrupting any religious meeting within the limits of this city, he shall, on conviction thereof, before the mayor or municipal court, be considered a disturber of the public peace, and fined in sum not exceeding $500, or imprisoned not exceeding 6 months, or both, at the discretion of said mayor or court."
Joseph repeatedly reminded politicians that the promise of the Constitution required action to ensure religious freedom for the citizens it governs. He did what we're encouraged to do today to protect our democratic rights, to participate in the process, write to elected officials, run for office, speak up, among other things. Our history as a nation demonstrates that unless citizens demand that government protect democratic rights, these rights can be ignored or unequally applied, especially for minorities. I find it so interesting that the reforms Joseph advocated were so forward-thinking. His proposal for banking reform was essentially acted 20 years later. Regarding penal reform, as late as 1983, the Supreme Court had to affirm that incarcerating indigent debtors was unconstitutional, and they used the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause for their analysis. That was an amendment to the Constitution that had not even been considered in Joseph's day. Further, criminal justice reform remains so relevant, pertinent today, and is the topic of great discussion. Slavery was abolished 20 years after Joseph's campaign. Plus, it took a civil war for that to be ended. As a country, we're still debating how we achieve the promises of the United States Constitution for all.
Joseph supported the participation in the democratic process of those who might vote contrary to even what he would have wanted. He took a principled stand. Anyone who qualifies under law to participate should be encouraged to do so, especially minorities, religious or other. He wanted the democratic process to work for everyone. Then, as now, Latter-day Saints wanted American democratic rights promised in the Constitution to be more than a myth. As a leading evangelical theologian recently stated, the Latter-day Saints in the United States just want a place at the American table. Joseph's run for the American presidency and his subsequent death highlights the need for the vigorous protection of democratic rights in the nation.
I'm so grateful for Joseph Smith for his prophetic role in restoring the Church of Jesus Christ to the earth. And I have a new appreciation for him as a champion of religious rights and democratic principles. His efforts on behalf of the saints are inspiring. I'm grateful for the rich legacy in our church of promoting democratic freedom for all.
Joseph Smith did everything he could to establish the restored church to the earth. This included him taking up the position of trying to fix the things that seemed broken to him. He was indeed God's prophet on the earth at the time, and he led the church, did the best he could, and I'm so grateful for the witness that I have that he was called of God by prophecy, that he saw what he said he saw that day in 1820, Heavenly Father and Jesus Christ, and they commissioned him to restore this church to the earth. I'm grateful for him and for the legacy that he has brought. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.
Amen.
The International Center for Law and Religion Studies is committed to helping secure the blessings of freedom of religion and belief for all people. Learn more about the center or find out how to get involved on our website at iclrs.org.